All right, hello. Hello, and thank you for joining us on World MUN Day for this panel on youth leverage and international negotiations. I'm your host, Wright, and today I will be interviewing Ciara Campbell. Ciara, would you please introduce yourself and maybe talk a little bit about your history and your research?
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to be here. My name's Ciara Campbell. I'm a recent graduate of the College of Europe and also a graduate of Queen's University Belfast. And I'm moving to Brussels soon to start work in a public affairs firm. My history is largely, I've recently completed my master's thesis on international negotiation theory. And I also have a lot of experience in model simulations of parliament and legislative procedures.
Mhm. All right, could you maybe talk a little bit more about your experience with simulations? I know you said before the call, you talked a little bit about how you hadn't done a model United Nations, but you did do model European Union simulations. Is that correct?
Yes, so I've done 8 model EU simulations, 4 as a participant, so either a member of the European Parliament or a member of the Council of the EU, and then I've done 4 as a commissioner, which is where you really write the policy briefs and guide the participants. So coming from an MEU experience, we kind of look at MUNs as very competitive. So I think the great benefit of MUNs is that you really learn a lot about negotiating in a team. So you're in teams, you want to get best delegates, and you're really competing with other people to be the best. And then also you're working a lot on policy. So you're learning very, very important soft skills of debate, persuasion, policy research. And with MEUs, you learn a little bit more about coalition building and building coalitions, for example, in the Council of the EU or in the European Parliament, which are also really vital negotiation skills to learn. And I really believe that simulations are a fantastic way to gain experience of what these international organizations are like that can really set you up for real careers in them one day.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, I've never done an EU simulation, but I imagine, like you said, there is a lot of coalition building. So it's interesting to think about the difference between EU and model United Nations simulations, though I'm sure negotiation still is a major part of both of those. Though of course it's youths negotiating with each other and not necessarily with any actual governments. So before we get into the main topic, I'd like to continue asking some more questions about you and your experience. So are there any youth organizations that you're a part of?
Yes. So right now I'm currently the international officer for Alliance Youth Northern Ireland, which is the youth wing of a political party in Northern Ireland. But previously, I've also been involved with Beta Europe, which is bringing Europeans together association, and also JEF, which are the Young European Federalists.
Interesting. So you said you were Northern Ireland Association. I imagine that has a lot of interactions with your national or local government.
Yes, it does. So we're the youth wing of a political party. So quite naturally, we have political party representatives, both at the local level and at the national level. So the way that we can really interact with these like local and national representatives is we can use our internal party structures to really lobby for policy change, to include young people's voices, and then that trickles through to our local and national representatives. However, more generally, young people can influence local and national levels by building relationships with them, with the institutions, and also by collaborating with other youth organizations in order to leave an impact on local and national organizations.
And have you noticed an impact with your organization on your government?
Absolutely. For Alliance Youth Northern Ireland, we're having an election next May, in May 2022. for the Northern Ireland Assembly, which is kind of our parliament. And Alliance is running the youngest amount of candidates. So we have quite a lot of candidates who are in Alliance Youth, who are actively involved, who are in their 20s. And I think it's just an amazing thing to get young people actually elected to the assembly. That's the biggest amount of change you can make, because then we're going to have young people who are the decision makers and who can actually affect the policy that will be implemented.
Yeah, that sounds incredible, fascinating. And so thinking more about how these sorts of deals go together. So we have in Northern Ireland, you're going to have young people being elected, hopefully. And then they'll be the ones who are actually able to make deals rather than as a youth organization trying to influence deal people into making deals. So could you provide an overview of kind of how an international deal comes together?
Yes, absolutely. So there's 3 parts to an international deal. The first step is preparation, and that will kind of include like the 2 organizations or 2 countries announcing, first of all, that they're in talks to prepare for a deal. And then it will include research, setting out a strategy, and also consulting with stakeholders about how they want to shape their strategy before they begin the actual negotiation. The second part is the actual negotiations. And this is the longest part and the part at which it's most likely or most able to fail or stall. And so the negotiations will have 3 steps as well. So the first step is preparation. And then the second step is the actual negotiation, which is what you see in the news of, oh, the Brexit negotiators have gone to Brussels for face-to-face talks, which are done quite over an intense period of about maybe 2-3 weeks. And then the negotiators leave and they go back and they debrief to their government how the negotiations have gone. And this process will essentially repeat over and over until either the negotiators become closer together and a deal signed, or they diverge and the talks stall. An example is the World Trade Organization, the Doha Development Round, and talks started in 2001. And then they were progressing for about a period of 7 years. And then they stalled in July 2008. And while the Doha development talks are supposedly still happening, no progress has been made since 2008. So that is the end result of most negotiations. They just eventually stall until they're closed. An example is the EU-US trade deal as well. However, the third step is ratification. And this is also quite a dangerous part of the negotiation as well, because this is a step where the negotiation has been agreed between the 2 governments or between 2 organizations, but they need to ratify it in those countries. So a good example is the EU-Mercosur trade deal between the European Union and Mercosur, which is the trading bloc for Latin America, such as Brazil, etc. So they actually came to an agreement for that in 2019 after 20 years of negotiation. Negotiation started in 1999. So this was quite a big deal. They finally got an agreement, and then it had to be ratified in every EU member state. And the Austrian Parliament Subcommittee for EU Affairs rejected the EU-Mercosur deal, which meant that Austria was obliged to veto it at the EU level. So the EU-Mercosur trade deal is in limbo now after not being ratified. But if you can make it through all 3 stages, such as Brexit, and everything is ratified, and the deal enters into force, then an international deal is concluded.
Oh, that's kind of a lot going on. And like you said, these deals can take, years, potentially a decade if the negotiators are having trouble coming to an agreement. So I'm curious then where young people and youth interests kind of fit into that whole process.
Yes. So young people would be part of the stakeholders. You know, young people have an interest that they want to represent. So they would be during the preparation and the debriefing stage, usually, and trying to make their voice heard at these stages. So they would be the one contributing to government surveys. How do you think we should handle Brexit? They would be answering and making their voice heard. And then they would also be receiving the government reports. Okay, this is what we negotiated. How do you feel about it? However, a common theme for many stakeholders is that they are listened to, but their words kind of go in one ear of the government and out the other. Young people are frequently heard, but their desires are not acted upon.
Why do you think that is?
Um, for an example, from the Brexit negotiations, young people really wanted, for example, Erasmus. They really wanted Erasmus to continue. And Erasmus is, as you know, the program for young people to go study abroad during university in another country's university. But in the final Brexit trade deal, this was taken away from young people. So I think that part of the reason why young people try to get their voices heard, but is not listened to, is partly because negotiators have a lot of stakeholders that really want to be listened to. For the government, they have young people to listen to, but they also have business, they have NGOs representing 1,000 different sectors, particularly for trade deals. Everyone will have an opinion, and it's up to the government and the negotiators which opinion they want to listen to, or which opinion they have the space to listen to. I think sometimes we can say to ourselves as young people, oh, they just don't want to listen to us because they aren't respecting us. And part of that is true, but part of it is that they just simply don't have the space to listen to everyone, unfortunately.
It's a little sad, unfortunately, like you said. So thinking again about the Brexit deal, and I understand that your thesis was on Brexit and those negotiations. So what sort of interactions did the British government have with young people for that deal? Like as stakeholders, how were young people involved in those negotiations specifically?
Well, first of all, I think Brexit was a real wake-up call for an entire generation of young people. It really radicalized an entire generation of young people to get involved with politics, to get involved with protesting against how the UK government was handling Brexit. For myself, it was the first time I had ever voted, was in a Brexit referendum. And yeah, so it left an impact on an entire generation. But you also have to bear in mind that there's many young people who didn't even get to vote in the Brexit referendum, who are still having their lives affected by it. Mostly because it stripped away the right of British young people who only have British nationality to move and to live in 27 other countries. So there was a really big protest movement in the UK during the negotiations, and there were countless youth NGOs who were really engaging young people, engaging them in what they think about Brexit, engaging them in surveys, engaging them in protesting. For example, one very well-known one is Our Future, Our Choice, which was a protest organization across the whole UK. Another one is the British Youth Council, who were also very engaged. So I would actually say that during the Brexit negotiations, there was a lot of engagement by youth NGOs to discover what do young people think, and then deliver these opinions to the government. Every effort was made. However, in the end, I think for what actually happened with the final Brexit deal is that basically there were like two youth priorities for the Brexit deal for what they wanted to happen. And one was Erasmus. They wanted to keep Erasmus. And the second one was some attempt at facilitating mobility so that they can live and work in 27 other countries. And neither of those were delivered. So young people in the UK now face a future where their human mobility has been vastly decreased to what it was beforehand. And I think that's a real shame for the generation in the UK. It means there's a generation who are coming after us who are going to be facing a much more insular UK and a world in which they don't have these opportunities to go to Austria or Bulgaria for a semester to study abroad, which is an absolute shame.
It isn't what, so thinking about stakeholders in that deal, what do you think the conflict was? Like who do you think in amongst the UK stakeholders, who do you think was fighting against that mobility for young people?
I would say it was what the government's priorities were. So when you're thinking about it from the government's point of view, they have many stakeholders, but they also want to ensure that their voter base will be intact at the next election. And they're also thinking about their parliamentary voter base. So in the UK Parliament at the time, there was a subgroup of the Parliament called the European Research Group, who had a big influence over parliamentary votes, because the government at the time didn't have quite a large majority. And so they were reliant on this subgroup in order to pass votes. And this subgroup was extremely against any form of soft Brexit. They wanted a very hard Brexit, and they wanted to take away Erasmus and human mobility. And the ideological view was they wanted to replace it with a UK that was focused more on the Commonwealth. So ideally that partnerships would be facilitated for Canada, Australia, New Zealand, other places like that. And they replaced the Erasmus scheme with the Turing scheme, which unfortunately is much more expensive than Erasmus and much more limited, as there's only a few countries which are involved with it. But if we're looking at the government's point of view, it's kind of like they have to listen to this subgroup so that they can pass votes in the parliament, rather than the 1,000 other stakeholder views that they have to listen to. It all comes down to politics in the end, unfortunately.
Oh, that is unfortunate. So, you mentioned the subgroup, you mentioned voter bases. Are youth considered like a major demographic?
Okay, so for demographics, I think youth are a really interesting case, because while race, class, and gender mostly stay the same throughout a person's life, quick disclaimer that transgender people are valid and social mobility does happen. But youth is the one attribute that everyone has, and then everyone loses it. It's with time. So young people represent 1/5 of the UK's population. So they are a major demographic, but they're often ignored. And I would actually say that the biggest thing you can do in order to support young people is, when you get older and you get into any position of power, you remember what it was like to be an angry young person who didn't have their voices listened to, and you try to put the ladder down and help the young people of the future. Before I worked in public affairs, I previously worked for the Department of Education in Northern Ireland, and I was updating their post-primary mental health support. And so I actually conducted research into how children and young people's views are represented in the government and in decision making. And I think what we also have to remember as young adults who are 18 to late 20s is we think we may not have a large amount of a say, but under 18s, I think, are the demographic who have the least amount of say. They just aren't even asked for their opinion at all. And I think it's a complete shame that young people are ignored in this way. Part of it is that for under 18s, it's people thinking that, or adults thinking that they don't have the capacity to say things. But I think the recent example of Greta Thunberg, for example, who was a 15-year-old at the time, who started a global protest movement, is that children and young people have valid opinions that should be listened to by the government at every stage of their life. And in fact, if you have children who are getting involved in decision making from a young age, from even 10 years old, and they can actively participate in decisions about their life and have influence, then that creates better active citizens as they become older and grow into adulthood.
Interesting. And it's interesting that you bring up Greta Thunberg as well, because again, I think she's the biggest example of a young person who's been able to influence the world stage and have influence in these sort of international deals. But of course, we can't have, millions and millions of Greta Thunbergs. We need, we need organizations, we need NGOs, we need that sort of community involvement to be able to participate as stakeholders in these sorts of deals like Brexit, like you said. So again, thinking back to Brexit, you said there were a lot of British young people who were protesting. What are the things were British people doing or not doing to make their voices heard?
Yeah, I think that we were doing everything possible. We were protesting, we were making surveys, we were getting people engaged in what do you think about Brexit. We were going on television, we were collaborating with youth organizations to really build coalitions. We did everything that was possible. I think it's a two-way street. So you have to be actively saying something, and there's plenty of issues which young people don't have enough of an opinion about. For example, the workings of the World Trade Organization. I think young people maybe can find that kind of boring, for an example. But an emotive issue like Brexit, most people have an opinion, or climate change. I think it's the defining issue of our generation. But it needs to be a two-way street. You need to get young people invested, but you also need to have a government and institutions of decision-making who are actually receptive and actually open to hearing young people's voices. And unfortunately, we frequently have the former, but not the latter.
Yeah, I think that's where my main question is. So as young people were doing everything that they could, where do you think that barrier was with the government?
I mean, I think the barrier for the government was specifically for the UK. I would say it goes into kind of the issue of London and Westminster is a very centralized decision-making process. So everything happens in Westminster, and then Westminster also has first past the post and a parliamentary government, which means decisions can really be quite centralized to the Prime Minister and his cabinet. So I think it also goes into the form of government, which you have. Meanwhile, if you have a PR government or a government where decisions have to be made on coalition, that kind of encourages listening to stakeholders and getting everyone involved. And then there's also the issue of that the UK, for example, It's a federal state, so England, Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales. But apart from young people not feeling like their decisions were being held to account or were making an influence, people also regionally didn't feel like their opinions were being taken into account. So I think also it's an issue with the form of government in the UK that it can be quite centralized, and they can kind of ignore everyone who's outside of the Westminster bubble.
Interesting. So, and that's the UK specifically. So during the Brexit negotiations, how did you see youth in the European Union reacting? Like, do you think they had more or less of a say in the negotiations than the UK youth?
Yes. So in general, I think the EU is quite good at engaging young people because, for example, there's the EU Youth Strategy, there's the European Youth Parliament. However, I would also criticize the EU for not involving enough youth in the negotiations as well. But I think for them, it's also an issue of the form of negotiation. So for the Brexit negotiations, they elected a representative from the European Commission to kind of be the centralized figure for 27 countries, for 27 member states. So once again, you have this kind of stakeholder issue where if you're trying to be one figure or one negotiating team, which is taking into account 27 different opinions, you don't have a lot of room to take the young people of these 27 into account as well. And then you also have to remember that the EU was largely reacting to what the UK wanted. So, I mean, it was the UK wanting to leave. Meanwhile, the EU was kind of reacting to that. So I would say, no, young people were not really involved from the EU side during Brexit negotiations as well. However, I do think one place where the EU has kind of listened to young people's concerns is the failure of the EU-Mercosur trade deal, because this largely has stalled, despite the fact that it's being completed, like nearly signed, it could be enacted. The reason why it stalled was because of massive climate change protests, because it would have really led to a lot of deforestation in the Amazon. It would have reduced beef standards, for example, and young people across Europe were really speaking up about this for climate change and saying, no, we shouldn't ratify EU-Mercosur because of climate change. And so actually the failure of that deal was kind of a response to listening to young people's concerns about climate change.
Interesting, and that's kind of good to know that there is influence out there, you know. Young people are able to make a difference, even if it's through less conventional means like protesting rather than, you know, being a part of the deals themselves, which I think is what we would all prefer.
Mm-hmm.
So overall, would you say that the UK and the EU governments adequately took into account youth priorities?
So again, no, I wouldn't say that. But I do have another example of where young people did influence international negotiations. And it's the current one, which is happening right now in COP26 negotiations in Glasgow. So unfortunately, this is quite a negative one as well, because many young people have come from all over the world to gather in Glasgow to really be in the negotiation rooms for COP26 and really influence the global leaders where they are right now. But unfortunately, they're facing an issue where they want to be in the negotiation rooms, and then they're being told that they can't be allowed in because of COVID room capacity concerns. So it's an example where young people have really showed up in order to try and influence, and then have quite literally been told, no, you're not important enough to be in the room, which is quite negative. But on a more positive note, I think that what you can really do and what Glasgow and COP26 really shows is that protesting does work. And I think it's been a wonderful opportunity for young people to really make their voices heard on the most generation-defining issue, which is climate change, and to really say to global leaders, this isn't enough, what you're pledging isn't enough, and encourage them to do more about climate change.
Of course, the thing is, we see with COP26, it's still, we're making our voices heard, but whether they listen and act on that in contrast to what their other stakeholders are telling them to do, I think is where a lot of young people like myself kind of lose heart.
And I would say that the biggest difference between other stakeholders and young people is that young people protest much more. I also have a history in student activism when I was a student, as I'm sure most of you also have a history of doing that. And I do believe that protesting works. Getting young people involved out on the streets with signs and marches and that kind of mass mobilization, it really can work to encourage some kind of leverage over decision making, over policymakers. However, I think it's more effective sometimes for national legislation. It's much easier to lobby people if you protest right the day before they're going to hold the vote. And it's much easier to sway the opinions of people who are making legislation rather than negotiation, unfortunately. Because with legislation, you have a public place where they're going to hold this vote, and you can kind of make that emotive decision and emotive reaction. But for a lot of negotiation, however, it's still behind closed doors in tiny rooms where it's usually the people who know a lot about the deal or about the deal that is being negotiated. So you have technocrats and you have high-level political representation. And that's why young people really don't have a lot of leverage in international negotiation, because it's hidden away and it's with people who know a lot and are really negotiating the fine policy detail. But the place for young people who can really want to make a difference is get in early at the strategy part, when the government are still deciding what their priorities are. Start protesting there and start making your voice heard.
Yeah, thank you. That's fantastic. So you kind of explained that young people don't really have a whole lot of leverage in these international deals because the leverage is held by the deal makers, and those priorities are informed by their stakeholders who are primarily considering voting concerns and the sorts of legislative groups that influence their voting bases, which is unfortunate that a lot of it comes down to domestic politics and domestic voting rather than people's actual priorities or a country's actual priorities. So you said protesting was one of the best ways for people to get their voices heard. So what other pathways are there for young people to kind of get into those negotiating rooms? Because like you said, in COP26, people are being told that they can't, all these youth organizations that work so hard to get there, to be there, to try and participate, are being told that they can't. So aside from protesting, in these youth activism avenues, is that the best way, or are there other ways that people can get involved?
So I think protesting is a fantastic way, and youth NGOs is a fantastic way. But I think the third way, as I mentioned before, is whenever you stop being a young person, when you get into these positions of power, when you stop going to MUN simulations and start going to the real UN, like as someone who is actually working there, don't forget that you were once an angry young person who didn't have a voice. The only way is for when you get into the institutions, make sure there is room and be receptive and listen to young people. I think also sometimes we forget how rapidly society has changed within the last 50 years. So 50 years ago, would they have cared about young people? No. I think also within the last 100 years, we've seen so many rights come forth, social rights for women, for transgender people, for gay and lesbian people. And I think also the time is coming for young people to really be more listened to. But the only way we can do that is by getting into the institutions and then becoming more receptive to the concerns of young people and really putting the ladder down behind us to let other young people up the ladder too.
Mhm. So hopefully you and I will try our best to do that for hopefully all these young people watching.
Yes.
And then so to kind of take it back to the beginning when you were talking about your Model EU simulations, because again, I think a lot of young people who are engaging with Model UN, we write resolutions. Sometimes there are opportunities to send the resolutions that we write to the UN or the bodies that the resolution would apply to necessarily, just so that they kind of know what young people are thinking, what our priorities are, or like what we're thinking about when it comes to these international negotiations. In your experience with Model EU, have you had any situation where actions you've done within Model EU have impacted or had an influence on the actual EU?
Let me see. I have to say that we've sent many reports to the EU institutions. And also, I do believe the one place where we've had the most impact wasn't at an MEU. It was actually at the European Youth Forum, which takes place every year in Milan, in Italy. And there we actually wrote a report, which was also sent to the EU institutions, but we actually received a letter back from them thanking us and expressing that they were going to take our opinions into account. But also that's a set up organization with the explicit purpose of gathering young people's opinions and sending them, not just as a simulation, but as a real gathering exercise. So I think for young people, simulations can be a great way of gaining these soft skills. So debates, persuasion, coalition building, also cross-cultural, talking to different people and learning more about the world. They are invaluable experiences. And I would really encourage everyone to get involved with MUNs and MEUs, even as organizers, and make it a inclusive and welcoming experience for everyone. But when we're talking about feedback, I think you really learn from these experiences, and then you can go on into other places and really use these experiences to influence organizations. So for example, if you learn how to write policy recommendations, you could write your own policy recommendation and send it to your local council or send it to your National Assembly and try and get it heard in that way. Or join a youth organization in your country and use these skills in order to lobby your local and national representatives.
And of course, as you get older, you take a job in these institutions and then use those skills to reach down and help people get up.
Yes, mentorship is also so important as you get older and get into the institutions. Like I would really encourage young people both to look for people who are willing to listen to them and willing to engage with young people. There's also like education committee chairs, for example, people who work with young people. Look for the people who are going to be receptive and try talking to them and building those relationships.
Mm-hmm. So in institutions, who is that most of the time? Like you know, if I wanted to talk to the UK government, who within that institution would be my best route?
Yeah, so for the UK government, for example, if you're a random young person in England, in the middle of England, and you want to affect the UK's climate change policy, I think, well, one, you would look for, okay, who is a person in charge of young people and education in the UK? So you have the kind of like very top, okay, who is that person? And then you kind of like go down and down. Okay, well, who is it for England then? And then who is it at my local level, in the local council, who's looking after education or climate change there? And try and get it in there and talk to people.
Excellent. Yeah. So thank you for this conversation. I think I think you've kind of elaborated a lot on what international deals are, what goes into them, and how youth factor in, as well as what young people can do to kind of make their voices heard and influence those deals themselves. And you've given young people sort of the options that they should be looking for their influence, and then as well, kind of going forward, what skills that they're going to need in their future jobs. So I think we've covered the topic of leverage in international negotiations fairly extensively, and how young people can kind of realize those priorities. So I want to thank you again for coming and for talking with me, and hopefully all the young people watching, and hopefully some of the old people watching as well, can learn from our conversation and learn from you and your experience and the world's experience, really, in listening to young people, and we can kind of continue this trajectory. Because like you said, I think things have been getting better, obviously, but they're obviously not where they need to be yet. If, you know, young people at COP26 are still being told that they're not important enough to be in the room, even though, like you said, young people make up 1/5 of the UK's population, but they're not considered that major voting demographic that has the same sort of influence that smaller groups do. So
okay. Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. And I think this has been a really great experience, and I've really enjoyed talking with you about this. And to the people in the audience, if you have any further questions, feel free to look me up and send me questions. I'll be happy to answer and try and help you with whatever you want.
All right, thanks. Bye-bye.